Hey, it's Mirna from Trainer's Toolbox. Welcome to the Trainer's Toolbox podcast, a place where you can discover practical and effective tools and tips to make your workshops more insightful, engaging, and memorable. You are at the right place if you're looking to become the best trainer you can be and design truly impactful learning experiences. Ready? Let's dive in. In this episode, I'm pulling together storytelling lessons from 4 brilliant books that will help you craft stories that connect and teach and inspire. Now, this is the 3rd episode in 4-part series about storytelling. So if you haven't checked the other episodes yet, you might want to have a peek into these 2. The first one was about finding great stories, second one about crafting great stories. Now we are at the episode about diving into the best tips from best storytelling books, and the next one will be on metaphors. So check out the others and make sure to subscribe for the channel also to keep an eye for the upcoming one. If you feel like this has not been enough of talking about storytelling, you have 2 options. One is to join me at Storytelling Bootcamp, 2 days live event to dive in really deep into storytelling. And the second one is to let me know. The best way to do that is through LinkedIn or replying to any of Trainer's Toolbox newsletters that go weekly. And tell me, what else would you like to learn about storytelling? What is your further question or dilemma you would like me to explore? Now, as this year I'm delivering the Advanced Storytelling Bootcamp for trainers and facilitators, I've been diving deep into storytelling really throughout the year and reading dozens of books. And the 4 that I'm sharing tips from today are the 4 that really stood out. It's amazing books with amazing insights. Now, I will share today 4 tips from each of these 4 books. But I do want to invite you to actually check out the books as well, because they offer much more than the tips I'm sharing here. They have really great ideas and insights, but also examples of stories. So you can find the list of all 4 books together with the tips I'll be sharing in the handout that you can download for this episode. And if that's not enough, if 4 feels too little, if you're a nerd for books like me, make sure to also download the Ultimate Book List for Trainers. It's a Trainer's Toolbox list that I created, which has more than 100 of books, I think, split in different categories, from training design to facilitation to coaching to presentation skills to storytelling, and outlines around 10 great books for each of these areas. You can also download that in episode description. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into the first book, one of the best books I read on storytelling, and that is the book Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. Matthew Dix is like rewarded champion storyteller. You can find his great stories also on YouTube channel if you Google Storyworthy by Matthew Dix, if you want to also see some examples of storytelling in action. But today we're going to more nerd out on the best tips I picked up from his book. Now, first thing that I got from Matthew Dix and that kind of made me really reflect on storytelling is his attitude and opinion that the stories we should be telling should absolutely always be only our own personal stories. Agree or disagree? Now, his point is that is so because that is the only way to truly tell an authentic story, and through that to truly get audience to relate to that story. And I hear his point. I personally don't completely agree. I think for us as trainers or facilitators or speakers, there are many amazing stories that we can find that are worth retelling and sharing with our audience, and that can have powerful insight or underline our learning design powerfully. However, what Matthew's tip on bringing into more our own personal stories into our storytelling, what it made me reflect is how, yes, as trainers, we could all be doing more of that. This is a little bit difficult, and it takes a bit of courage and also a bit of effort to really think, how do I find some of my own stories that I can bring in? and it feels a bit more personal, and sometimes it feels a bit egocentric, like putting ourselves too much in the spotlight, especially if we are more on facilitative side of things, not on storytelling side. I can share that for me, when I was delivering TEDx talk, this was one of the toughest things, to talk about me. I kept wanting to talk about insights and lessons that I wanted to share, and as I was preparing and asking few friends for feedback, they kept saying, but you need to underline this with your story, with your examples. And I find it really difficult, because it feels funny to stand on a beautiful stage like on TEDx and then be like, you know me, I've done this and I've experienced that. It's tough to talk about personal stories, but it's also really, really powerful. Then it makes the message we're bringing in really authentic. Now, if you struggle to find your repository of own personal stories, I would highly recommend checking out the episode that I created on that topic. I think it was episode number 10, where I'm sharing one really powerful exercise, actually from this same book, about finding your stories. And if you feel like you need support with that, you can always join me on a bootcamp, or maybe in Trainers Conversations, which is an online community of trainers in which we often talk about stories and share stories and build our stories together. So check the link if you're curious, also in the description. Now, the second tip from Storyworthy was that every story, in a way, is about a moment of personal change. And this was really interesting for me, because always we listen and we read and we hear about storytelling, that it's all about this drama and transformation, and how in some way it's always about building up the tension and adventure and so on. But he really nails it with this insight that, in a way, every story we tell, especially if it's a personal story, it's a story of moment of personal change. And very often that will mean it is a moment of insight, a moment when something clicked for me, or maybe a moment of courage, or maybe a moment I did something I was not able to do before. So in some way, it's a moment of me stepping into the unknown, and in some way going through experience that in some way changed me. And this is very aligned with the theory of hero's journey, but it is just made, a little bit more personal, making that moment really, really personal. So that one way you can use this insight is to really reflect when telling your story. If you have some stories that are personal that you're already telling, you can reflect a bit. Which change did I actually experience here? What did I learn? What was my insight? How did this experience change me? And this will make your story stronger. But you can also use this to fish and look for your stories and find different stories from your experience, because you can actually be fishing for moments of change. When did I have an insight? When did I learn this? Which experiences in my life, small ones, which small conversations do I remember because in some way they changed me? And it will help you enrich that repository of your stories. Now, the tips 3 and 4 of Storyworthy, I already shared also in video about building your stories, because they're great. So you might want to skip them if you saw that video. There is no repetition after that, I think. But they're really powerful to build better structure and to build more tension and more drama. Now, tip number 3 to build better structure is to think about your story in scenes. And this is something that will help you immensely. What do I mean by that? If you design list or like set of scenes, like set of steps that happen within your story, kind of like storyboarding it, this will give you a lot of power and energy. First of all, it will free you up from overthinking how to make sure you memorize your story, because you just need to memorize this list, this set of scenes. Often they're not that many, maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6 if it's a complex story, but it will make it really easy for you to remember the basics of the structure of your story, and then to really immerse yourself into the storytelling itself, and to kind of, be more engaged with your own story and be more natural as you're telling it, because you won't think about everything that you memorize by heart, but you will just think in these few scenes. But this will also help you to really design a good structure, because you will realize if the story is too complex. When you write down the main scenes and you see that maybe there are a little bit too many, you will also realize to have strong enough contrast between the scenes, because all the scenes should be, sort of a change and contrast between each other. So it will help you really nail down that structure. So to play with this, whichever story, even maybe stories you already know and telling often, can you map them down to a series of scenes and see how to maybe improve them. A little trivia fact, I don't know if you maybe read the book Creativity Inc. That's about Pixar's process of being creative and building that creativity, or maybe saw the Pixar's course on storytelling, on visual storytelling on Khan Academy. But in these places, they keep talking about how storyboarding and putting the scenes in order really help them to actually save movie Finding Nemo and make it a really good movie. Because initially, when they built the movie, they built these parts where Nemo's father, Marlin, is very paranoid about his son and so on, and very overly protective and so on. And they put the part about how he lost Nemo's mother and the rest of his family quite late as a background story, but quite late into the movie where he's kind of remembering of that event. And then they tested that with internal audience, just with those storyboards. They tested the story. And they actually got feedback that audience kind of hated Marlin because he was so overprotective and annoying. And even though they learned his very touchy background story, by the time they learned it, they already had quite negative attitudes towards him, and that story wouldn't fix it. And then what the team did is that they simply reshuffled the order of things, that some of Marlin's background story and, memories and so on come in much earlier in the story. That scene was simply moved from end to more towards beginning. And that changed a lot into how audience perceived the character, how the drama built up, and so on. So thinking in scenes can also truly help you improve and strengthen that structure. So it's not just about having the list of how it will go, it's also about questioning it. Which part should go sooner, which part should go later. It's something I'll share more about also in the last book today, about how to play with that order of different scenes. Now, the fourth and last tip from Storyworthy, also really powerful one, is to keep always raising the stakes for your hero. And what I mean here, if hero is not having it difficult enough, the drama is not big enough. If audience is not involved enough with seeing how difficult things are for the hero, it also means they will not feel so fulfilled and they will not have so much relief, and they will not enjoy when hero actually gets rewarded or saved or whatever it is at the end. Because of that, it's really good practice to always see how can I raise the stakes more, both in terms of adding in extra obstacles, but also in terms of explaining a bit better why this hero cares so much about his goal, or why these obstacles are so difficult for him, and so on. Again, if you look at this, just this theme of raising the stakes and the size of the challenge and the size of heroes caring about his goal and fearing of the challenge, if you observe this in any of big movies, you will see a lot of this, how this is built up. So if you put this lens, you will start noticing it everywhere. And if stakes are not high enough, and if hero is not stressed enough, the audience doesn't really like the hero as much. They don't want him. They think he got the reward too easy. They don't appreciate his award at the end, and so on. His reward, sorry, not award, at the end. So you really want to think, basically, how do I torture my hero more? How do I apply more pressure? How do I explain that more? So this is also a really quick hack if you want to improve and strengthen the drama and the emotion and the tension within your story, and the engagement, of course. To go back to story you already told previously, or the story that you tell often, and just think, how can I raise the stakes more? How can I, add on a layer of an extra obstacle? Or maybe, how can I add a moment where I clarify a bit more why this hero, being it me or someone else, why this hero cares so much about this. Now, one more thing, maybe to take away from the Storyworthy summary, I just wanted to kind of quickly put all 4 tips together. So in Storyworthy, Matthew Dix talks about owning, like bringing in more of personal stories, own stories into our storytelling. He also talks about a moment of personal change, that every story in a way needs to represent a moment of personal change. He also suggests thinking in scenes to strengthen our structure and also offload our memory a bit. And he talks about raising the stakes to build more drama, to build more engagement. Now, I hope you found these tips insightful, and I do want to invite you to maybe take a little break here, pause the video and think a little bit, how will you use one of these 4? Which is the one that will really be interesting for you to experiment with a little bit. And you can also find this summary in the handout that you can download in the notes, so you can also reflect on it a little bit deeper if you would like to. Ready for the second book? Okay, this one is one that I would most highly recommend if you're doing business presentations in which you want to introduce storytelling. It does have many valuable lessons for trainers as well, but it's really focused on that persuasion and business presentations. And it's the book Resonate by Nancy Duarte. It's an amazing book, and let me share 4 quick tips about it. First, maybe most insightful bit that she shares in her book is about the shape of a great talk. And she basically said every great talk, you could think every great story as well, basically, has a certain structure. And he says that structure is, you start by establishing how are things right now and how it's not really great. You don't have to paint a very dark picture, but it's like, the boring reality or the or bad negative reality, whichever it is. And then immediately and kind of sharply, you contrast it with your vision for better future. And according to Nancy Duarte and Resonate, good storytelling and good tension, it's all about this contrasting. So you start with status quo, what is happening right now. You go into the bright future. You come back to what is now. You go back into the future. And you play with that, building it towards climax. And climax is basically your call to action. So in that shape of a great talk, you end up with you build the climax around call to action, and then you close and end with that picture of a new bliss, of the transformed future. And according to her, this structure, and she maps it to many great talks and analyzes many great talks to show that. But in her tips, this makes it really memorable and makes it really persuasive. So if you're thinking how to structure something you're building, if you're working with teams or organizations, this is a great structure. Now, another aspect, another side of this idea and this structure is something we can all apply very much to every storytelling, not just the business one, but also the business one. And that is that story structure is really about ups and downs in terms of emotions. And she suggests, more in business context, to always contrast between what is the current, the present reality in which you ground people, and then uplifting what could be, the bright future, and to always iterate between these two to create that tension. But in reality, it could be any other, conflict or tension as well. But the important thing is to always be creating these contrasts between uplifting emotions and pulling people down, between hope and challenge and tension, and then resolution, and kind of going up and down and having this emotional flow of powerful presentation would be something like this, right? So in classical storytelling, emotional flow, it's a bit more like a pyramid with where the peak is a bit moved towards the end. It's not centralized. So it's more like building up towards the climax and then suddenly down, kind of to relax that tension. But in reality, in most of new, elaborate and complex stories, we will have many peaks like that and many moments of tension leading towards climax. And this is one also variation of it that we can very much use. So interesting to explore. Now, there are two more bits I wanted to share from the book Resonate. Tip number 3 is that every goal of every presentation in some way is change. And you could think about that also every goal of every workshop or every talk or every even exercise within the workshop is really to create change. And she says that too often we focus on trying to create that change by, sharing information or whatnot. But what truly creates change is resonance, is when audience really resonates with what you're sharing, when they can really imagine, when they can really feel it, when they empathize, when they put themselves in that story and in those shoes. That means that the most important element of your story is your audience. And wonderful thing she says that many other storytellers say, that you are not the hero of your story. Instead, your audience is your hero. You're maybe the wise guide, maybe, but your audience is the hero. And the better you understand them and the more you build that story around them, the more you will achieve the resonance and the more can you create that change. Now, this is a little bit complicated because before we talked about how every story should be personal. Now we are talking about how stories should be about audience. Not very straightforward conclusions here. This is all food for thoughts and thinking how will you apply it in your storytelling. But there is definitely something to that idea of taking audience on a journey, telling them how the world could be, building that bright vision for the future, exploring possibilities for them through the story. And then finally, the fourth tip by Nancy Duarte is that every story, in a nutshell, in its core, it's really about drama. So the main thing you want to build, regardless of structure, regardless of everything else, the main thing you want to really focus on is building some drama there. And the best way for her to build drama in more of this business or workshop context is to build it by creating desire and then also showing how your idea fulfills it. I hope Resonance gave you some good insights from shape of a great talk where you start with the current reality and then build towards the future and then you contrast to also supporting that contrasting with strong emotional ups and downs and flow, to thinking about every talk or story as something where we're trying to create change and understanding that audience is the most important element in that change. And finally, to equal story with the sense of drama and to understand that what creates drama is desire that you create in a listener and then showing how your idea fulfills it. So Resonance, even though it's written for business speakers and presenters, by all means, it gives some great tips about storytelling in general. Highly recommended. It's a gorgeous book. Now, our book number 3 is the book called The Perfect Story, and it's all about stories that inform, influence, inspire. And I'll go through this one a tiny bit faster. It's fairly simple, straightforward tips, but still very powerful. By the way, it was really funny to extract some of the tips from this book because I realized that many of the tips that I would take from this book would be very similar to tips by Matthew Dix from Storyworthy. So while they're different books and they have very different approach and attitude, they have many overlapping points. But I try to dig in for something new in this one. One of maybe most important things that is shared in this book is that stories are made, not found. And by that, what she's actually saying is that great stories are formed by repetitive, iterative editing and shaping and actually working on that story. And she says the idea of the story, it's not as relevant as the shaping it and editing and actually creating it into a powerful story is. And I think this is a great lesson because it's very in the spirit of growth mindset, basically saying it's not like, somebody has great stories because they're lucky, so they can tell all these great stories, but it's much more about, the craft and the work that we put in and learning that craft and practicing it and doing a lot of practice and getting feedback and learning new tools and just kind of working harder in a way to build better stories. Second, really simple, really powerful point from this book is that ultimately what makes story really memorable is making them very specific and grounded in details. So she says broad is forgettable, and specific details, grounded in details, that's what makes the story different and story memorable. That's back to what I shared in the previous video about building your stories, when I also talked about how we want to use the concrete and vivid and sensory language and colorful language. That very much relates to this point, that ultimately the spice of the stories that makes them shine is those vivid words with sparkle over them. And that's all about details. That's not about big ideas or abstract concepts. It's really about tangible, concrete, vivid, memorable details. Now, tip number 3 from the perfect story is that relatability is what truly makes story powerful. It's funny to see because everybody else keeps talking about drama, hero's journey underlies drama a lot, resonance underlies drama a lot, but actually both The Perfect Story and Storyworthy as books put very much in the spotlight this idea of relatability, how people will resonate with the story when they can really relate with it and they can put themselves in the hero's shoes. And it's very interesting, especially in Storyworthy, because Matthew Dix keeps sharing how he has some very dramatic experiences in life and very dramatic stories, like being robbed, almost dying in a car accident, and so on. And yet how these are not his most memorable and best stories, because they're very extreme and people can't really imagine and relate to them so much. Yet when he tells a story about very relatable little moment that he experienced, I don't know, in a conversation with his wife or with his first crush or whatever, then suddenly people really connect to that. So we really want to think in terms of relatability, and because of that, often small stories will actually work the best. And then final point number 4 from The Perfect Story. Yes, somebody had to say it. There has to be a clear point in the story. Like we have moral of the story in more traditional storytelling, in our storytelling, in the context of, workshops and learning and so on, we really want to have clear intention why we are telling a story, clear goal, clear takeaway. And this is something that if we don't have, we need to question, should that story even be there? And if there are multiple takeaways and points, we need to pick the ultimate one, like for any good presentation. So very brief to put together the 4 tips about perfect story. First, great stories are made, not found. So art of editing and shaping a story is what is truly the art of storytelling. Second, they're grounded in details. The more specifics we can bring in, the more memorable it is. Third, relatability matters more than drama. And fourth, we want to have one clear takeaway for each story we tell. Now, the wonderful thing about tips from The Perfect Story is that they really speak into how our stories don't have to be grand and special and huge and unique and like amazing experiences, but how truly small stories actually have a really big power to engage and change and pull in. So be brave with sharing your small stories and not just looking for, my stories are not special enough, I should have something more dramatic. Now, the last book that I want to share, it's a little bit different because it's not as famous as the first 3, yet it's really wonderful book. Highly recommend to check it out. It's called 109 Rules of Storytelling. And it's by a storyteller who keeps sharing many, many tips, like on LinkedIn and in different places. And he chose to put them together in a book. And it's really beautiful book with many very creative tips. And not really a structured storytelling guide, step by step, but much more diverse tips and guidelines that you can kind of pick up and incorporate. You can see that even in the name, it says rules, has a little asterisk and says they're more like guidelines, really. So it's really about exploring and seeing what works for you. Having that said, it has some really, really good points about the storytelling. One of my favorite is the structure he calls 4 I's. And it basically says, Structure of any story, and by the way, you can totally apply this to workshop segment too, is number 1, inspire. Let me read it first. Inspire, inform, involve, and instruct. Okay, inspire, inform, involve, and instruct. And it basically says, first, inspire, meaning hook them emotionally. Second, inform, meaning share some valuable content with them. Third, involve, get them to engage or reflect. And instruct, give clear next steps or takeaways. For all trainers in the room, I don't know if you're using format as a structure in your workshops, but for me this very much resonates with the format as well. It's about kind of sharing the why would people care, then sharing a bit of, theory and information, then building really active engagement in some way for the core and the meat of our workshops, and then building some future-oriented, takeaways and exploration. So this is a really powerful structure we can also play with in a story and in a structure that we built. Now, the second lesson from 109 rules is that you really don't want to lead with facts. You want to lead with emotion. So he says, if you want to bring in the data and facts or cause action, you should always start with emotion to create connection and to create engagement. Then you do want to back up that emotion with relevant data too. And finally, you want to guide them towards action. What do you actually want people to remember or implement? And you can think about this as a structure for a whole workshop or a whole presentation, but you can also think about it as a structure for story. Like even in a story, you could start with emotion and then bring in more informational things and then have some call to action and change. But you could also use a story as just the emotional bit of this, that you engage with the story and then you present maybe scientific data and then maybe some plan of action and so on. So story could be plugged in here just in emotion bit, or could really encompass and tie in together all 3 parts. This is the way to really lead towards more engagement. Now, tip number 3 from this great book is not to start in a classical way, and not to start with once upon a time, and not to start with some story that's happening somewhere else, but to seek as much as possible to really start our stories with audience's world, with something they've experienced. And this is especially if we talk about presentations and workshops where it's about change in their environment that we are inviting them to build, or change in their behavior and so on. So he says you could use lines something like, you've probably been in a meeting like this, and that's a great way to start a story. Or maybe, that feeling when blah blah, this happens, right? And that calls for relatability. And I would very much say we can't start every story like that. It really depends on what the story is and what the background is. But I do see a big power in starting like that. That situation, and then storytelling it and painting a picture, and from that inviting towards some sort of learning or change or next steps. And finally, the last little bit from 109 rules is to lead with tension instead of chronology. And this is a great idea in terms of how to start your story. He says basically, drop the audience at the beginning of your story, in the middle of the action or conflict, and then circle back to fill in the details. He says, kind of think about it as, that movie which starts with very dramatic moment and something unveils and it's short and it's dramatic, and then ties back into something like 3 days earlier or something like that. So that's a structure that he suggests for a story, and that in workshops we could really open with moment of crisis, telling about moment of decision, moment of emotion, instead of agenda and what is next. So we can apply this to stories in 2 ways. One is to consider story a moment of tension and make sure we bring in story at the very beginning of our workshop or a talk. Or we can also think about it also as a structure of the story, where we might want to start the story with the moment of tension, drama, crisis, emotion, and then kind of circle back in and then keep on building it. I find this super interesting structure to explore. To me, it's not super intuitive, so I would not naturally use it in most of my stories. but it's definitely something I want to play with and experiment with. I find it super powerful. So very quick summary of the insights I shared from 109 Rules of Storytelling. I shared about 4 I's model: inspire, inform, involve, and then instruct. I shared about powerful idea of sequence, emotion, data, action. Start with emotion, back it up with data, and then build towards action. A powerful idea about starting with you and audience's world instead of some imaginary world. And finally, the idea of leading with tension, jumping into tension first, and only then going back to chronology. I hope you discovered some cool tips in this episode. I'm pretty sure it was also slightly overwhelming and a bit too many tips to process and use right away. So I do want to invite you, well, you can give it another listen as well, but you can also download the handout from the episode description and give it a bit of thought and reflection and actually set some action points. How will you use and leverage some of these in your stories? With storytelling, implementation is really hard. It's hard to find courage and opportunity to actually jump into telling those stories. There is a lot of hesitation that I see also in myself and also in others. And that's also one of the reasons why I built the Advanced Storytelling Bootcamp for trainers and facilitators as a place where we can kickstart that and really launch ourselves into telling our stories and practice it for full 2 days and exchange ideas. We also play with storytelling a lot in an online community of trainers called Trainers Conversations. So maybe that's also a softer and easier place for you to explore with monthly 2-hour call instead of 2 full live days. Check it out also in the comments. And please do grab some of these books. They're amazing. I don't know which one to recommend first. Grab all 4 and you will find many more on that ultimate book list for trainers and facilitators, which I'm also linking in the episode description. Looking forward to seeing you soon in one of the future episodes. The next one is on metaphors. Make sure to keep an eye on the channel, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you see when the metaphors are out. And if you have any feedback, I would love to hear. Send it over via LinkedIn or maybe reply to one of the Trainers Toolbox newsletters. See you soon. Wish you an amazing day. Tell some story today already. Use these tips. Put it into action. Thank you for exploring this topic with me. I hope you found some exciting ideas and valuable tools that you will use already today. Remember, they only work if you put them in practice. But then they make all the difference. If you enjoy Trainers Toolbox podcast, do leave a rating and review. It does mean a lot. And if you haven't done it yet, click on the links in the episode descriptions and discover free materials and valuable resources to dive in deeper. See you in the next episode or at Trainers Toolbox newsletter.